Hi, everyone. It's Hugo Bowne-Anderson here from Outerbounds. Welcome to our first Fireside chat. Very excited to be here today with Hilary Parker, talking about how to produce sustainable business value with machine learning. And we'll get started in a few minutes. So in the meantime, please do introduce yourself in the YouTube chat. Let us know where you're watching from, what you're interested in with respect to machine learning and data-powered software more generally. And we'll get started in a few minutes. Feel like we need some elevator music or something, but my beatboxing skills aren't up to scratch. Hi, everyone. It's Hugo Bowne-Anderson here from Outerbounds. Welcome to our first Fireside chat. Very excited to have Hilary Parker here today to talk about how to produce sustainable business value using machine learning. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. In the meantime, we'd love for you to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're watching from, what your interest in machine learning and product management on all of these things are. And we'll get started in a couple of minutes. All right, everybody. It is with great pleasure that I'm Hugo Bowne-Anderson, by the way, head of developer relations at Outerbounds. And today I'm very excited to be speaking with Hilary Parker, who I'll introduce in a second, for us to chat about how to produce sustainable business value with machine learning. To that end, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and share my video, and I'll ask Hilary to do the same. Hey there, Hilary.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Fantastic. Great to have you here today.
Yeah, I was appreciating you saying your name because I think in my head I always thought Bowen-Anderson, and so I'm sure that's common.
It's very common. I also get Brown. The human mind will insert the R into it constantly.
I can see that. Yeah, just looking at it.
There are so many problems with my name, including the hyphen, because a lot of databases don't like hyphens, right? So when flying, my ID rarely matches what airlines will. One of many concerns about the length as well. Also, starting with a B means like people on Facebook, when they create events, you'll be at the top of their list to be invited because it's ranked alphabet. Anyway, the trials and tribulations of a hyphenated name starting with a B. I would like to welcome everyone here today. This is very exciting for us to have our first fireside chat, and it's such a pleasure to be doing so with you, Hilary.
Thank you very much.
I'll get you to tell us a bit about your background, but I would like to let everyone know, for those of you who don't know Hilary is a data scientist and independent consultant who has worked at Stitchfix, Etsy, and as a data science product manager for the 2020 Biden for President campaign. You also have a podcast, which you've been doing for many years now.
Yeah, almost, I think 6.5 now. So
that's wild.
Yeah.
And it's called Not So Standard Deviations.
That's right.
So anyone, if you enjoy this conversation, please do check out Hilary and Roger Peng's podcast as well. Just a bit of housekeeping, so to speak, to start off. This is a conversation, a fireside chat. Feel free to ask any questions in the chat. We've got someone from Indonesia who's just joined and someone from Brazil as well, which is exciting. If you have any questions throughout, feel free to ask them in the chat. We may get to them during. If not, you can ask them in the AMA on our community Slack afterwards. And I've pasted the link in the chat as well. And if you haven't heard of Outerbounds, we're just getting going now. So what we're really excited about at Outerbounds is we want to give data scientists as many powers as possible by making it easy for them to interact with modern infrastructure, from scalable compute and data warehouses to orchestration systems. So we're focused on building tools that allow data scientists to focus on what they want to while having access to all their infrastructural needs. We've been doing so through an open source framework called Metaflow, which my colleagues began and open sourced at Netflix, and we're excited to build products around it now as well. So if that sounds interesting, definitely check us out. Without further ado, though, I'm really excited to start talking about best practices for PMing data and ML-powered software, what data scientists need to know about product management for data-powered products. I'm really excited to talk about failure modes. Sorry, somebody just wrote there, tuning in from Alpha Centauri. So welcome from the cosmos. And also talking about how companies and data science functions in orgs can think about producing sustainable business value. So I've introduced you briefly, but I wonder whether you could just tell us a bit about your background, how you got started in the data world and your career so far, with particular focus on data products, PMing, that type of stuff as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So my academic background, I was sort of on the straight and narrow academic path through a PhD. So I got a PhD from Hopkins School of Public Health, and never was like totally convinced I want to be a professor or anything. I feel like I was the classic case of like grad school's the new college, where I didn't know what to do. And so I was like, oh, I'll do grad school. It seems like a good idea. And so toward the end of it, like I said, I never had like hopes and dreams of being a professor. So I was exploring, all the options. Tech was really exciting to me. I was like a late adopter of tech to some degree. Like I wasn't very tech focused until grad school. And then, I reached out. So I was just talking about this I did a Twitter Spaces earlier today as well. And like it's not generalizable, but I got very lucky reaching out to some key folks, including Hilary Mason, which people get us confused all the time. It's to Hilary Mason Parker. Yeah. So I just literally
a single L.
Yes, that's
okay.
That's why it's confusing. Well, one of many reasons. But yeah, both a single L, both spelled the right way.
I love our inordinate focus on names and spelling today as well.
Yes. Hey, it's
Yeah,
important. It's important
it
stuff.
really is.
Hilarys are especially like into this. So if you ever meet a Hilary, ask how many L's, like she'll be like, oh, I'm so glad you asked. Like,
Awesome.
yeah. And then act like whichever one they say is right. So but so yeah, I reached out to her. She was like so generous with her time, and she was working at Bitly at the time, which was just really cool stuff because they were essentially early days of like tracking the internet and like what does it mean for something to go viral, and they had like this unique vantage point. So anyway, was convinced to go into tech, wanted to move to New York, went to Etsy, and that's where I picked up like product analytics. So I was essentially a product analyst there. And I worked under this amazing boss, Nell Thomas, who went on to become the CTO of the DNC, Democratic National Committee. So you can see how this, how it started to progress. But yeah, so then quickly realized that product data science is very similar to biostatistics in terms of like experimentation and measuring impact and effect sizes and everything. So then moved from there to Stitchfix, where it was sort of I was both doing product analytics and I was able to focus more on like data product development. And so got to work a lot with like developing new data streams for products and thinking more holistically about the problem, as well as just collaborating on like our existing data streams. So like what data do we need to collect in order to like give clients the right clothing and style them. So for those of you who don't know, Stitch Fix is like a personal styling and like kind of like online shopping experience. So anyway, then yeah, with the Biden campaign, I focused more primarily on the like product management. I mean, I was there for 2 months, so everything is like in a campaign is very, you're doing whatever is required at the time. But basically, as you can imagine, in a presidential campaign, especially one that like I felt was extremely important for the health of the nation, you really want to make sure that the numbers that you're producing as a central data science team are accurate, that they're delivered reliably, and those things end up having as much impact as the values themselves. Because if you have a team that really wants to use numbers, but your infrastructure is constantly failing you, like it kind of doesn't matter how good the numbers are, as you can imagine. And so that was a lot of, how do we QA things? What do the processes look like? How do we ensure that we're delivering the right stuff? And so, yeah, since I've been consulting, also took a lot of time off, which I highly recommend to everyone. And yeah, so I think I rambled about your question long enough.
Well, that was all very, very good context. I also encourage people to take time off. I've started recently at Outerbounds and had 3 months off beforehand, which was very, very restorative. I like, you've worked in a variety of different verticals. I think which the variance is interesting, because Etsy we can think of as a classic tech company in a lot of ways, classic e-commerce, right? Stitch Fix is a variation on this. I wouldn't take this analogy too far, but I think of Stitch Fix in the same way as I think of Netflix, for example, which is not classically an industry which is tech per se, but a company which is deeply rooted in, and actually both deeply have tech as foundational, right? Like entering perhaps other verticals, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely, Etsy's like the biggest differentiation. What I thought you were going to say is that Etsy, you like don't own any physical inventory and it's just an online marketplace. So it really is in that sense, like a classic tech company versus Stitch Fix. Like we own like, I guess they own the inventory. And so there's like the risks of a traditional, like, department store. And so as a result, the company is structured differently. And like, there's just more irons in the fire in terms of like, having an entire team for like warehouse management and, inventory management and who's buying the inventory. And so, but then like you pointed out, tech was very central to that company's like unique competitive advantage of like, oh, we're going to take data really seriously. And then the product itself was unique for those who aren't familiar, where it was like, you would, for as a client, you would sign up on the site and you would fill out questionnaire and like give, you know, information in certain ways. And then the company would take that information and send you a box with 5 items in it. And those items would be personalized to you through a combination of algorithm and then also like a human stylist.
Yeah.
Since then, they've kind of veered away. So it's a lot more online shopping focused now. And so that's, you know, there's pros and cons, obviously, to any business decision like that, but still like the data is like front and center there. So
yeah, and in fact, and I do want to kind of zoom in on this. Both companies have positioned themselves via multi-threaded, the Stitchfix blog and Netflix's technology blog itself, as being at the forefront of data and tech. So what I want to start thinking about now in this conversation is, how can companies think about producing sustainable business value with machine learning? And perhaps, I don't know how you want to slice it. I'm interested in any way you'd like to, actually, but we could look at companies where tech and data are first-class principles, such as these companies, and then companies which are trying to develop their machine learning functions as incumbents or as smaller, you know, places. So more generally, how do you think about this?
No, I think it's a really good point, because that is a really key differentiator in companies. And I think it does impact the way that they view the algorithms, like department or org or whatever you want to call it, and like how they evaluate what's going on when they add these features. So like a company like Stitch Fix, where it was very clear, like our strategy for going public, our whole strategy is competing in like what is a pretty cutthroat space, frankly, of and same with Netflix, really, like, you know, entertainment's really cutthroat, and clothing is really cutthroat, and also very established industries. And so in both cases, I think that it was strategically positioned early on that like data is going to be our differentiator. I mean, Netflix had others. They really are very, now that I'm thinking about it, they're very similar, because Netflix started with like, we're going to send you these like DVDs.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. And it may be worth mentioning that, I mean, Eric Colson, who ran data at Netflix, then went to Stitch Fix. So there is even, you know, in terms of the hiring and the messaging, broad and positioning of a company, there's something there, I suppose.
Yeah, I think, I mean, absolutely. I think that's part of why he was recruited and joined so early. He was like a very early member of the team. And I think that there was some iteration with that. So it was like at Netflix, I'm not sure what his title was there, but at Stitch Fix, he like was this chief algorithms officer. And so that's like this whole new job title that like didn't really exist then. And so, yeah, so like, I think in companies like that, where it's pre-IPO and this is like a newer thing, but where it's like, oh, data and algorithms are going to be our competitive advantage. So we're bringing on data people early, we're prioritizing this team, you know, like, instead of like tacking on a data scientist after a while, it's like, no, we're going to like cultivate its own vertical, going up to its own like chief algorithms officer. You know, that comes with pros and cons, because part of that strategy with Stitch Fix was to not have a dedicated product team for a really long time. And so they built out the product team while I was there. And it was like, I don't know, like a year, less than a year before the IPO, that there was finally like a VP of product and product managers and all that. So so it was kind of like you couldn't avoid it forever. And I feel strongly that these teams need to like come together, which is obviously why we're having this discussion. But you know, I think it's an evolving space. I don't think that there's perfect answers yet, because like the average data scientist wanting to build machine learning products is probably a different personality type and coming in with different expectations than an engineer working on, you know, a software product, for example. And maybe that's unfair. Maybe I'm not sure that it should be, but I think realistically that's how it is right now. And then, but to your point, yeah, like in companies where it's not seen as a competitive advantage, you see a lot of more of like the tacking on. So like, oh, we're going to tack on a recommender system to the bottom of this page, or like we're going to, like I think a lot of people like are like, oh, we have this pile of data, like let's do data science with it, let's make use of it. And I think that can be a pretty challenging, each of these scenarios come with their own challenge, right? And so yeah, I'm not sure if that actually answers your question, but that's
it gets part of the way. And I do think the analogy with more classical software engineering is important, both in why it's a good analogy and why it's a bad analogy. I think we're all trying to build software, and from software engineering, import best developer practices, I think, is something that we need to constantly be thinking about for the data space. I think we're a decade or two at least behind, so it makes sense that we haven't figured out division of labor, developer tools, that type of stuff, in a very different state with the injection of venture capital into the tooling market, which I think is a challenge we're all trying to figure out with respect to what tools we use, and what tools we need. This is, of course, something we think a lot about at Out of Bounds. What tools we need as data. Like I personally think I should not be spending 10 hours like I did last week messing around with SageMaker permissions and roles, right? So if we can abstract over that, or like configuration files or whatever it is. So if we can abstract over that with tools, I think we'll get to a closer place. But I do also think the demonstration of value and when it's adopted is probably a different question. So I suppose one question is, when should companies, and I mean, this is a very broad, there will be a different answer for different verticals, but when should companies adopt machine learning and when shouldn't they? Or when is it useful and when is it not that useful?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so one of my big overarching philosophies about this field right now is that for example, data science, it's really blown up in the last 10 years. And one consequence of that is that there's a lot more data science training in like MBA programs, or, people who are like business people are coming in now with like more formal data science training, maybe not trained to be a practitioner, but trained at least to kind of understand the words that a data scientist is saying and understand how to evaluate things. And so I think that's a net positive. I think that if you look back like 5 years, especially, there was so much like hype around data science. And I think that still exists, where it's like, oh, we're going to throw a bunch of money at this problem. It's going to like magically solve. We'll hire like a magician to come in and they're going to magically make more business value happen.
I just want to zoom in on that very quick. I mean, you've identified a key. There are two key concerns and then a continuum between. One is people who are like, hey, we've been doing this for years, ML, whatever. I don't care. Right. And they stare into the void. Then there are the other people who see, the Oracle of Delphi or whatever it is, right? And they're like, oh, yeah, here we go. There's some like wizard science that turns out to be the Wizard of Oz in the end. And then you have to, get rid of a function but where is the world in between? Like, we need to get in touch with that, right? The whole continuum of possibility there, as opposed to these two reasonable but naive initial takes. So how do we find that space in the middle?
I mean, like I said, I think that getting more so this is where I'm like, I think traditionally data scientists have kind of bulked, and like I said, in some ways the organizing principle at Stitchfix was like bulking at the amount of control that like product people would have over data science development. And like it is harder to say we're going to add this feature and this is the expected impact, and like we've seen it before, so we have reasonable estimates. So there was a reason why it was like kind of magical at first, of like, we don't know how much this is going to help. But I do think that having executives and product managers who are more versed in understanding how much you can reasonably expect, like we're just accumulating more history, like you said, of this field. But I do think it's really important for product people and like the C-levels, obviously, but just people involved in a client, especially a user-facing product, or really any product, to do the same type of opportunity sizing that they might do for a more traditional feature, so that it's like that idea of like, is this a key competitive advantage, or is this just like nice window dressing, I think is really important. I was recently looking, and also is it box ticking for a company as well? Exactly.
I mean, a lot of organizations would be like, hey, does that involve AI? And you're like, I mean, I can put a logistic regression in somewhere, but
yeah,
is that really what we want?
I mean, I think that is like, it's hard not to start to sound like you're just trashing data scientists, but there's like a lot of buzzword. Like it's easy, you know, like when you're looking for funding as a startup, it's like, oh, just add AI. Like you might be doing simple linear regression, but if you say AI, you're going to get more funding, or, you know, so.
And it's not just in industry. It's not just, as you know, my background is in biophysics and cell biology. I mean, the amount of grant, and this is not how it used to be. The amount of grants I had to just like say I'm solving cancer or Alzheimer's in was, and like everyone had to do that, right? So we are entering the simulation of like kayfabe, or it's a lot of this is live action role playing some of the time. It feels right.
Yeah, no, and it's like, it's not like the world, you can't live in a vacuum where like everyone is being reasonable. Like, you know, VCs are dealing with a lot of information and they need to be able to like hone in quickly on what's the hot new thing and what's a true differentiator. So I get it, even though it's like kind of annoying.
Yeah. So once again, I think we're circling around this really nicely. How do we find the value? And I love the idea of making sure that people at all levels in an organization have access to the information they need at the right time. And even, you know, I think like heads of growth, for example, don't need to understand the intricacies of, you know, multi-arm bandits, but I think they do need to understand confusion matrices and why you need to do AA tests sometimes to make sure your telemetry is correct and these types of things. So what type of things do people need to know for the job they need to do?
Yeah, wait, I think I'm confused by the actual question. So like,
I'm sorry. Yeah, that was actually a statement, but it started with a what. Yeah.
Okay. I was like, wait, okay. Yeah, no, so, I think you're totally right, where it's like, and I think, so one thing, you know, this thought popped into my head as you were describing that is that I feel like for the business leaders, for executives, for even like product people, it can really be beneficial to have, and I this is going to sound self-serving, but I'm not suggesting me, but like having an independent advisor who can come in and do some translation for you. So like if you're in an executive position where you really want to add machine learning, but you don't feel like you have that background to suss out, like, can I trust the people who are telling me that they need all this money to do all, and it's going to return like all this stuff. Having someone who you can bounce the ideas off, who's product focused and who can say like, oh yeah, like Netflix tried this, or Stitchfix tried that, or Etsy tried this, you know, and like, oh, we didn't see as a big return on this, or actually there's a huge return. Like, I think, and again, maybe executives are already really good at this and I'm just preaching to the choir, but I think that having like not making sure that you have advisors who you trust in order to, who don't have a vested interest in like funding the machine learning team or funding the data science team can be hugely helpful until that education gap is narrowed, of like executives learning what machine learning is exactly.
For sure. That makes a lot of sense. Something that just came to mind, we were talking about Netflix and Stitch Fix, very technically sophisticated companies, right? And we do have this thing, I wouldn't put Stitch Fix in it per se, but of, you know, FANG data science, right? And the question whether people who want to do, let's say, what we would now call something like more reasonable scale machine learning, which perhaps is the 80% or 95%. We are the 99% of data practitioners. And we don't need Kubernetes for everything, right? And I think there is a percent, and we don't need GPT like 11 for everything as well, right? So there is a question of when building out reasonable scale ML functions, what the difference is and what people need to do. So from your experience, what are your thoughts on that?
No, it's a really good question because it's been something I've been thinking about a lot recently and really relates to your product, which is like, how much do you want your ML like how much are you comfortable with it being like a black box? Because like you can develop an ML product pretty cheaply if you're just like, okay, this like out of the box thing is fine, and we're gonna have inputs and have something come back, and we don't need to understand how it works. And like something I've been chewing on a lot recently is like the same way that you're generalizing, like there's so much repeated code when it comes to implementing this stuff. And like you were saying, for the average data scientist, it's not a good use of resources to have them rewriting implementation code or like redoing something that is generalizable. And so it's like, where is that boundary where at some point it's like, oh, and like probably this black box recommender system would be like pretty good for the product that you're developing. And so I don't have any good answers. That only half gets at the question that you were asking, which actually, can you remind me exactly what you were asking now?
It was about kind of the long tail of data practitioners and companies, and how machine learning will differ for them. And something I'm hearing there as well is that it's really important to be identifying business concerns and figuring out whether ML can help to solve them, as opposed to back engineering. Hey, we have these data scientists and machine learning engineers. Let's figure out what they can do, right?
And it's kind of funny because I feel like I've seen all the failure modes of this, where it's like, on the one hand, if you don't throw resources at trying to develop a good algorithm, a good implementation of it, like a good UI for that algorithm, so that the recommendations are actually compelling and not just like a tiny list at the bottom of the screen that the user never sees, like then you can prematurely say that it's not helpful, right? And then on the other hand, I've also seen, like, I'm just laughing like at the same company, I've seen where like you pour enormous resources into like an interactive recommendation feed that's like the new homepage or something, and then you don't have the opportunity to like to actually test whether or not it's going to be helpful. Like basically I've seen people throw a ton of resources at what sounded like a sophisticated, good recommendation system, but it didn't really map to user behavior that well. And it ended up getting retired fairly quickly. And it was like the amount of pressure on the ops team to implement it was really high. It was really, really expensive in terms of the tooling. And so it's, again, that's where I'm like, I don't think this is that different than any product development, where it's like, you know, you need to opportunity size, you need to break up these experiences into small testable chunks before you just take a huge leap. And I think that there are times when it really is hard, like for like a social network, it's hard to like test like a small version of the social network, because part of it is like how many nodes do you have in the network, and like, you know, so sometimes you have to take that leap of faith. But I think, again, I feel like kind of the situation I was alluding to wouldn't necessarily happen today, because it's not as much of a like, oh, this is a magic wand that will save everything. So yeah,
that doesn't happen so much today in like companies that have figured it out. I think it's a great kind of warning from the future for companies that are adopting ML now.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important lesson. I love the idea of having small testable chunks.
Like how can you prove out empirically that something is a good idea without necessarily breaking the experience apart so much that you're testing like some small, like unusable portion, and then when that test comes back as not impactful, you're like, oh well, this won't matter. And it's like, well, you only tested like a really handicapped version of the experience, so it's not actually, you know, gonna be compelling the way that the full product will be. So I think
that's a key failure mode to have learned, in particular. Not being realistic about what you're experimenting with, and what the potential ROI is. What are there other failure modes that you've seen that you think could be instructive here?
I would say so if you have a mature data team, so not super mature, but like if you've like committed the resources and you're like, okay, we're going to build this and we're going forward with it. I would say the biggest trap that I see data science teams, like ML product teams, falling into is optimizing the wrong metrics. And so like, I mean, metrics isn't, but like optimizing the wrong outcome, where it's like, I think that there can be such a divide between what the data science team wants to do and like I shouldn't say what they want to do, but the type of thinking where it's like, okay, give me the outcome, and then I'm going to try a bunch of different fun models and do some feature engineering, and I'm going to really like optimize the heck out of that outcome, versus the product people like might be thinking more holistically about the product, but aren't necessarily communicating that. And so that divide becomes very problematic very quickly, where you might be optimizing for some sort of user behavior that, if you thought about it carefully, actually doesn't make a ton of sense. And like, this is an industry-wide thing where you see like clickbait coming from. It's like, oh, if you're going to optimize for clicks on the internet, you're going to really quickly have a race to the bottom of like inflammatory headlines and like anger inducing stuff, which is like plaguing all the social networks right now. So,
or if you optimize for view time, as we know YouTube did, I mean, they're far more nuanced now, but it will start leading you towards more divisive misinformation as well.
And so it's like, how do you, as a data scientist, like, it really behooves you to be actively involved in like defining what the user behavior will be. And I think a lot of people don't realize that like the person who actually defines what you're optimizing is driving the product more than anyone else. Like, because that's ultimately like, that's like the name of the game. That's, you know, what you're ultimately saying people should do. And I've seen people come to the data scientists and like the data analysts, including myself, to be like, hey, you tell us what's important. And it's like, that's actually a lot of responsibility, and that can feel scary. So I can see how data scientists would be like, no, you tell me. I don't want to be responsible for it.
I actually think there's something I used to share a lot. It's this reminds me of type 3 errors, right? Which are the right answers, but to the wrong questions.
I like that.
And it reminds me of a slide that Renee Tate, who is, for anyone who doesn't know Renee, she's on Twitter as Becoming a Data Scientist. She used to have a podcast that very early on, about a decade ago, actually very much inspired me as an educator and these types of things. But she has a slide that I'll try to dig up and share at some point, which is, it's about what we need to be doing is, it's essentially a commutative diagram for people who know what that is. It's like with arrows that, you know, the loop completes whatever. That was a horrible explanation of a commutative diagram, but you've got business question going to business answer. And she says we need to be factoring that through data question and data answer, but we need to make sure the mappings from business question to data question and then data answer to business answer are what everyone thinks they actually are, right?
Yeah. Oh, that's a really good way of thinking about it, because, and one of the things I advocate the most, like on the podcast and sort of in my like public presence, if you will, is that data scientists are really uniquely positioned to zoom out and think about like this big picture of like, are we actually answering the right question? And like, how could I think, like, put on the design thinking hat, or like think like a designer and say like, well, let me reframe this a little, and maybe this is actually going to get at the concern. Like, this is the classic problem of someone comes to you saying, I want a number, and you're like, if you're just like, here's the number, done, like that doesn't actually serve the company well, and you'll probably get into like an infinite loop with them about refining that number, versus if you can zoom out and when someone asks you for a number, the first question should be like, what do you need it for? Like, why don't you tell me the problem, and like, let's think a little more holistically. And again,
as humans, I suffer, like, we're not particularly great at asking for what we actually want, right? That's part of our cosmic joke, I think, right?
Well, and it's like, it's not wrong. It's a way of communicating. And it's like, you know, it's a really positive interaction. I think most people would respond really positively if you're like, I need this number, and someone's like, okay, let me understand what you're actually saying. And like, I'll learn about myself in the process, and like I'll learn about the subject area. I'll learn about like, oh, you're right, I am thinking bigger picture. Thank you for helping me like realize that. And so unless it's like a really tough, I think that dynamic of like, give me a number, like, oh, I'm mad giving you a number, like that can turn toxic. So I'm sure it's not always like a happy interaction, because sometimes the relationships are so strained already. But like, yeah, shifting that to the ML product and like thinking about machine learning, it's like a very similar thing. And I've seen like at Stitchfix, for example, there was a number of different outcomes. Like we send someone an item and a fix, and then they buy it and they fill out a survey about what they like or not. And it was pretty fruitful to start playing around with what that outcome was, to say like, okay, it's not just that you buy it, it's that you buy it and you don't complain, or you buy it and you said you love the style, or like you said you loved it, but you sent it back because it was the wrong size. Like there's a lot of nuance there. And again, you have to understand the user behavior, and is the person actually like, it's like, what's the bias in that data set? It's the people who are even willing to sit down and fill out like, you know, the survey at the end of the fix. And so there's a lot there, but I think it's good for the data scientists to know that, and it's good for the product people to know that, so that they can work together in a really healthy way to come up with like the right algorithmic experiences.
For sure. So I want to jump into that now. I do want to just make two quick statements before that. This challenge of connecting the data function to the decision function is such a big challenge that, you know, even a couple of years ago, McKinsey I don't know whether it's taken on, in all honesty. McKinsey like was pushing and created a role called data translator, which is essentially someone to be that interface to making sure communication goes.
I didn't know that, but that's super interesting. Yeah.
And the other thing, we were discussing proxies, and I direct everyone to Rachel Thomas has a beautiful post on proxies in data science and machine learning, and what's known as Goodhart's law, right? If you're optimizing for something, you actually end up doing things to hack it. And I think there's the apocryphal tale of a nail factory where people are told to make nails that collectively weigh the most, or like they're optimizing for total mass. So they just create really large, like one really giant, really heavy nail. And that's like, oh no, we want to optimize for the total number of nails. So then they create a lot of really bad, really tiny ones, right?
Yeah.
So
it's so funny. I've heard that. Yes, I've heard that anecdote, but it was in connection to like the USSR. Like I wonder if that's just that tale has like morphed, where it's like growing up in America, it's like, this is wrong with communism.
It definitely sounds like Western hegemonic propaganda to me. So, but what I'm interested in is I've got a kind of a constellation of questions that we can just riff on in any way. How does product management meet data science and machine learning? And how can data scientists think about this? How can product managers think about this? And particularly one thing, I mean, we know data teams, we've got we've got embedded structures and like centers of excellence and hybrid structures. With product management, I hate this term, but product managers generally have a lot of soft power. Like people say you're the CEO of a product. That's clearly not true, right? In terms of, I think the leverage a CEO versus a PM has to be honest. But when we have such kind of roles that are in flux, how do even these two meet, and disciplines which are evolving very quickly? One other thing I'll throw into the mix is, because of data science, products don't exist. And what I mean by that is there's not like, what is Google search? I mean, there is no static product. There are so many experiments happening constantly that it's kind of, you know, you can never even step in the same river once or something like that, right? Because it's moving so quickly.
Yeah.
So that was that was a brain dump, right? But
it's and I've spent so much time thinking about this, and I don't know that I have the answers, but I can certainly say what I've been thinking about, which is that I totally like. And this is where, again, the education gap comes in, where it's like, is there a future where product managers come in with such sophisticated understanding of algorithms that it's like they can just PM the whole thing? But we're definitely not there right now. So it's like, if you have, you know, a product that has a lot of it's like I keep saying recommender system, so I'm just going to keep saying that, but it's like, if you have a recommender system and it is also part of a user-facing product that is not like super simplistic. So, I mean, but even like the Amazon, you know, recommended thing, there's a lot of product decisions that go. And
this also generalizes to search and feeds and all of these things, right? So it is a very general term in that sense.
Yeah. And so it's I have not yet been convinced that one person is capable of PMing the entire thing. So it's like the user research and the algorithm development and the product development and the like engineering, like the PMs that I've worked with are usually doing the user research, they're working with the designers, and they're doing the engineering stuff. But then the algorithm itself is like tossed over to the algorithm team. And so then it's falling into the hands of like a single person or some sort of central ML team that itself has to interface with this product person, right? And so this is exactly what you're talking about, where it's like, should you have a translation layer between that and the PM? Because like the PM is the translation layer between like the user researchers and the engineers. I mean, usually they're all working together and it's not like a wall, but that the PM is facilitating that relationship and making sure that the insights from one are getting to the other, and like doing design sprints. And there's lots of different ways that product development happens in a mature way. And as we've kind of been circling around, like I just haven't seen that as much in the data world. And I'm saying as much because I'm like, I feel like I can just hear people being like, we do that, I certainly, like, I feel like whenever I bring this up with other data scientists who've been around the block, they're like, yes, this is a problem. Like, Absolutely. It just doesn't happen the way you want it to. And so, and I think what exacerbates this problem is that unless you're like a really big company, I think there's some resistance to this of like having an algorithms person who's like a tech lead versus the algorithms person who's like this interface layer. And so it kind of will end up falling on the manager's shoulder to do both. And at least in the companies I'm aware of and like what I've seen, usually the managers of the algorithms team are promoted because they're like really strong ICs. They know a ton of machine learning. Like the data scientists want to learn machine learning from that person. And that's great for that leg of the development. But in terms of like interfacing with the product people, that doesn't always that's not necessarily the optimal person for that. And like I said, I think that the machine learning teams that I've been familiar with have this allergic reaction to like these translation layers, because it's like, oh no, like it's usually it'll be people from academia, or it's people who like are just like opinionated, or I don't know why, but it's people who are kind of like, hey, I can manage this myself. Like, it's insulting that you think that I can't like interface with this person. Like I've seen it just break down a lot, basically.
Yeah, and I understand that. I think whenever you introduce, I'm highly skeptical of translation layers. Whenever you introduce another human, another role into the mix, it introduces a whole bunch of complexity that we need to figure out whether those externalities are worth it, essentially, right?
Yeah, but then it's also like, how are you realistic about like what's just too much work for one person, and like what is someone happy doing? Like, I think that there's been a move within data science to like, oh, you need to be full stack and you need to understand like all parts of the business. And it's like, but wouldn't, like, similar to like the tooling you're building, it's like, wouldn't data scientists be happier not doing this part of the job? Like, because it's not necessarily adding value. And so it's like, I mean, that's kind of like the whole point of a PM, is to like remove roadblocks and like make your life easier and get projects moving smoothly so that you can focus on what you want to. And I'm not convinced that every person building a machine learning engine of some sort like wants to be doing that level of product development. Because like, personally, I think that there should be a data scientist in the room and like doing design. Like, I think they should be in the design sprint saying like, oh, okay, well, the way the designer is imagining this recommender system, like the way you have it now is actually pretty hard to do and pretty hard to predict, but we could like change it a little this way and it would be easier. And like, maybe we need to collect new data in order for this thing to work well. So like, let's also develop this new data collection layer in order to do this thing better. So like, that's not necessarily something that someone who wants to be writing code all day is going to want to do. So yeah, I don't like, I I don't think I have the answer, like I said, even though I'd like to think that I know everything. And
Well, if you had the answer, I wouldn't invite you on a public live stream to do it. I'd suggest we build a company together and try to get some of that upside. Because I don't think we've figured it out as a discipline and a community. We're still figuring out really significant division of labor questions as well. And as you alluded to, that is something I mean, the paradox of that, Ville and I are teaching so Ville works on Metaflow and is the CEO of Outerbounds. We're teaching a tutorial together at ODSC.
Cool.
I like that conference. It's great. And so our tutorial is called Full Stack Machine Learning for data scientists. And I had to I wrote a thread on Twitter essentially that explained why I don't like that term at all and why we needed to use it. Because I don't want to create any full stack machine learners or data scientists, but what I think we need to do is have tools which allow them to focus on the parts of the stack that they want to focus on and gives them access to the rest and educate. So you need to know about compute layers and that type of stuff, whether you need to know how to configure all of, the Kubernetes stuff is another question.
Another thing that I think, again, because software engineering is just a little more baked than data science, is like a more realistic discussion of I totally see why full stack data scientist was a thing. It is realistically it is a thing for a small startup where it's you're going to need one person, and also for consultants,
as well.
For sure. Yeah. And so it's it makes sense that when the field was new and it wasn't huge established teams, it was one person. It was we need someone who can get the data and can do the models and can write the code to get it into the product and
But the joke is, of course, they're not a data scientist at all at an early stage startup. They're a data engineer for 12 to 18.
Right. Months, exactly. And so it's I think that there's the continuum of stable versus nimble, right? And I think that in the engineering world, you're more familiar with okay, we're we need to be more stable versus less nimble. But I think that again, I can feel people being I do that, but I feel the average data scientist isn't probably as experienced at making those trade-offs and being yes, my job is now going to be more annoying in order to make this more stable. I think there's a huge drive I want to keep it nimble so I can be creative and I can adapt and I can, create more, and I'm worried about we're not creating enough business value with this algorithm. So I need to keep that nimbleness. So yeah, it's it's funny because this conversation, I'm this is really hard, but it is, there's a lot. There's complex trade-offs because it's not there's a lot of ways to make a data feature better, collecting better data or changing the outcome or, building a model that takes into account bias better so that when I check out from Amazon, I bought a trash can, it doesn't tell me to buy 22 more trash cans at the end. It's there are ways to start to adapt an algorithm to deal with that. Yep. Versus an engineering feature, aside from, and I don't want to sound like I'm downplaying it, but usually it's okay, where's the latency? Is this doing what we thought? We could design it differently, but it's not the guts are going to change that much.
So who does machine learning product management really well in your mind, and what can we learn from them?
I honestly don't know the answer to that question.
That's great.
Yeah.
So I'm hearing there's nobody does it necessarily super well.
I don't know the inner workings of every tech company enough to be I don't know. I couldn't point to one company and be they're nailing it. One time I had a conversation with someone at Thanksgiving. I was at a Friendsgiving and it was another person there and I was that guy really got it. Where he had built out, and it wasn't even a machine learning team, but he had built out, he was working in customer service for one of these big financial companies where you're I don't even know how to describe it, but it's an investing, personal investing type thing. And so they have clients who are people and they have a big customer service team who's deciding are these people gonna churn? Should we do more personalized outreach? Like, how do I keep my clients? So it's client retention, basically. And so he had taken a few of the people who were interested in building models and created its own like data science team within this org in order to create data-driven scores to deliver to these teams in order to say like, okay, in addition, like for the customer service people who are evaluated on how many clients they retain, we've now produced this number that you can use if you choose to in order to manage like the client relationships. Right. And then presumably the people using it are like, oh, this is a helpful thing, so like I'm going to use it more. But like the tenets that I thought were really, like the reason I was like, he did this really well was because taking practitioners and making them the people who were building the models, I think is really key for trust. And then I think that making the product itself optional for the consumers, so it's like they still had the autonomy of their job. Like it seemed like a really well-defined output, product for the CS representatives, because it was like, oh, now you can like, you're not going to blame the algorithm and like shake your fist at it, like, because you're choosing to use it or not. So you still have your autonomy. But that's obviously not the way to build like the world's most sophisticated model. And so
But do we even need the world's most sophisticated model like most of the time?
I feel like no, which is why I'm like, how often would black box work, And like, so one way to, for example, like make this like in between role work is by saying like, okay, we're actually going to like contract the machine learning out to someone else, right? And then the person who's that contact for the contract is like the person who's that translation layer. And that's where I'm like, I couldn't tell you when like that makes sense versus ramping up like someone who doesn't have the background who wants to learn this like very like highly valuable skill. Like when does that make more sense versus when does it make sense to build this internal team?
Look, this is such a key point where my mind and many conversations I have around these things end up going this direction. But essentially one thing we need to do and we're trying to do here is pattern recognition, right? And figure out what's appropriate. And the thing is, we are at such an early stage that pattern where we're just getting an idea of the landscape and finding our compass and essentially, right? So we're trying to kind of form these patterns to see what we can and can't do and what's appropriate. And clustering, well, essentially.
And having something that like is adaptable. So it's like maybe you start with like a black box solution using like generalized tooling, and then you also have your roadmap for like becoming more like sophisticated on whatever, so it's like, okay, eventually we want to control the guts of this, but we still want the tooling to be generalized, or like, eventually you get to the place where like you've built your own custom tooling, although I'm also like, I don't know that like actually makes sense. But there's path dependencies though, where it's like, I think that what I've seen at these companies that I've been at and like other companies I know is that if you like invest really heavily in one modeling framework, or like you build like brittleness into your models, then you can't like do the hot new thing. And there is like a major disadvantage to that. So basically Absolutely. It's hard. Product development with machine learning is really hard.
So we've got around 5 minutes left, and I'd love to think about two things. The first is, then they're correlated. The first is who should be thinking about doing PMing ML stuff? Should it be PMs wanting to learn the ML side, or data practitioners wanting to learn more about product management? And I think we have more data practitioners here than people who are PMs. So after that, maybe we can let them know things that they could learn to help them learn more about product management.
No, I think any product manager would be very well served to learn data science stuff, I should say. So like, getting a more sophisticated understanding of how these algorithms work, or how like optimization works. Like, I think that's just a good idea. On the data practitioner side, like, I think that like, my first impulse was to say people who are interested in management. I think this is really critical. And again, I think that the field pushes toward people with like fancy technical skills to become the managers. But I think realistically, if you want your team and especially the company to succeed, I think that like understanding like the product management side and how to like both retain the trust of your team, but also push them toward like meeting the product needs. Like if you're not having the team directly interface with product all the time, then being that translation, it makes a lot of sense for the manager to be that translation layer. Like they're already doing that with like HR, like, you know, they're like, that is who they are for like every other part of the company. And then, yeah, I think that as I've seen so many people interested in this data PM role. And so I think one thing that is super critical for now is that in order for data people to actually trust a PM to tell them what to do, like being pretty strong on the data front is key. And so I think that having someone who is a data scientist who's like doing more product management, I think that's probably the only path in a lot of companies for how to, so you have to have a company that supports this idea generally, which I think I've miscalculated in the past, frankly. But I think that there is the potential for like really fruitful relationships there, assuming that like everyone's kind of on board with the idea. So I kind of want people to still push that forward, even though I've seen it fail when like data people are like, you don't need to get in between me and the product team, I'm fine. Or like, you know, manager, like there's lots of ways where taking on project management, I think, can rub data people the wrong way. So it's not perfect, but I still think people should be trying to do it, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that. And something we haven't even talked about that maybe we can do another time is, I mean, product management's such a fascinating field in that it's, and discipline in that it's not as well, like you don't go to school for product management, right? Like you enter companies usually in a different type of role and take it on and these types of things. And I think it is probably emerged originally like as project management in Microsoft or something like that when this type of role started to, and there are a couple of books and that type of stuff, but you really learn about it on the job. I just thought of a slightly provocative question that it might be fun to wrap up on. Where's the provocation though? I think my real question is, will all software soon be powered by machine learning? And will all PMs be machine learning PMs? And I just want to clarify, by machine learning, I don't mean machine learning, actually. I mean powered by data of some like introducing the entropy and complexity of the real world through an interface with real world data in some sense.
Yeah, that's a good question that I've really never thought of. Like, I could see like you're saying kind of like adaptive design. So immediately I was like trying to think of simple products where I'm like, would that really need it? But then my head was like, well, honestly, like if a product were like seeing, okay, she uses these features in this way, so let's adapt the product to like highlight those features more so that it's easier for her to use. Like that actually seems like a pretty good idea for almost all products. So yeah, I don't know. That's a really good question. I do think like the more simple version of that question of like, will understanding machine learning be critical for PMs like going forward? I think that answer is yes. And also for executives, where it's like, you just, again, like you're kind of vulnerable to the data science team telling you whatever, you know, like pulling the wool over your eyes if you don't have the ability to push back and to like have that conversation with like a level of knowledge. Like I think that's a big thing with managing. You have to make sure that the people you're managing aren't like taking advantage of you, you know, and just like telling you, oh, this is really hard and you don't understand it, and you're like, okay, I guess that's true. Like and so I do think that's critical. I don't think, I mean, even just with experimentation, I think it's really important for PMs to be able to like gut check.
And actually, I'm glad you mentioned experimentation, because I want to tie this back to product development and tool building more generally. I think the introduction of tools such as Optimizely is one of my favorite examples of how that changed the game for what everyone in an org needs to know based on the value that technology can deliver. So the fact that non-technical people could suddenly start doing online experiments with their websites and that type of stuff was an absolute game changer. And similarly, something like I'll give the example of the totally unproductive, unprovocative example of using machine learning in hiring flows for resume screening, right? You don't necessarily need to know about gradient descent if you're using that, but you better know about confusion matrices. And I saw recently, like from TFX, import fairness, and it better not be an API that does something like that, right?
Yeah.
So you need to be deeply aware of these things. And maybe there's a broader, part of the reason I think there's an incentive to use machine learning. My mind's just firing in a couple of different directions right now, so I'm trying to rein it in. One of the reasons it may be useful, or you have an incentive to do it, is the amount of resumes you get, the amount of information and I think we have hit this inflection point from information scarcity landscape to information abundance, right? And I always use the analogy of when we started having food abundance in the West. Suddenly, for example, you need to, like, previously, if you see food, you eat it because food's scarce and you need it, right? Yeah. Suddenly, when there's a huge abundance of food, you need to have a different relation. Otherwise, you get like nationwide obesity and such things, as we have a big problem with in Australia, for example, and in America, of course. So what happens? What changes when we move from information scarcity to information abundance? And the importance of machine learning there, I think, is key, purely in terms of ranking, essentially, right? Yeah. Scoring what's important to take in and what's important to not pay attention to at the moment. And resumes. Coming back to resumes, that's when you get a lot of resumes coming in because of the technology that allows that to happen, you need that. And what do people need to know? And these are the things that we're getting at now. That is, I think we've made progress. There's still a lot of topology to explore, I think.
I like that. Now that's a really good analogy. I really like that, where it's like, we're in, the information age, man, it's made things complicated. There's a really good documentary and book about, oh my gosh, I'm not going to remember it. The guy who essentially invented information theory, mathematician.
Claude Shannon.
Yes. And have you read, it's like a Mind at Play? And then there's also it's funny, it's like a documentary, but it's acted out with people, but it's based on an interview. Yeah. I saw it. Wow. There was an event in San Francisco where they put
I love some reenactments in documentaries.
Yeah. It was a little confusing because I didn't realize it. I was like, God, these conversations are so Hollywood. I was like, oh, right. Because they are actually acted. They're not. That's not actually him. But I think he would have been very, very ambivalent about the result of his research, the information age that he essentially unlocked, because he was ultimately went to designing unicycles and juggling and stuff. He didn't engage in the information gathering behavior after that. So anyway, information age is I have ups and downs with that. Well,
we'll have to chat about that another time. And in fact, I've actually got this book next to me. I'm using it as a microphone stand. James Blackwood, but this is a beautiful, oh no, my screen isn't. It's called The Information. Okay. It's an incredible book about information theory. It starts off with former civilizations that would communicate across great distances by playing drums, and the rhythm of their drums would communicate through to Napoleon's control of mechanical telegraphs through to the information age. Beautiful descriptions of entropy in there as well. James Gleick has been on my mind recently because he's been an advocate of removing time zones from the world completely, which I think is relevant now with daylight savings forever. Yeah. I feel like we could talk about this for so long. We do need to wrap up. We've got some really interesting questions that I'm going to ask people to put in the Slack channel, because we do need to wrap up. But for example, there's one about the PM topic being a chicken and egg sort of problem. Orgs needs PMs that can code, but it's tough to convince those who can move into such roles. And if they do, they don't have the PM skills. So how to figure out these types of things. Incredible questions that I'll get everyone to ask in Slack. And that's to remind everyone, we're having an Ask Me Anything, which it'll be async. So if you join our community Slack, I'm going to put the link in the chat again. And just over the next week or so, ask questions early, but Hilary will be popping in every now and then over the next week or so. If you have any questions for me, I may not be as lucid or clear as Hilary, but feel free as well. I'd like to thank everyone for joining. If you enjoyed this, please do share it with friends and hit subscribe, because we're just getting started as well. So thank you all for joining. But of course, thank you so much, Hilary. This has been such a fun conversation, and it's always great to chat with you. But to do this for the first time publicly has been a real treat.
Yeah. No, thank you so much. This was great. And I thank you to everyone who listened, even though I cannot see you. I appreciate it.
And you'll see them on Slack.
Yes.
So we'll all see you on the Slack, everyone. And thanks once again. And scene.